Hello, it's Employee a Million, and welcome to MOUSECOMS, where enough Mickey Mouse cartoons are in the public domain to where I can do a commentary track for them. More information will be in the description, but this is essentially the pilot for the Mickey Mouse series before the concept of pilots was even really a thing. It's called Plain Crazy, and it was test screened on May 15th, 1928 before being released with added sound on March 17th, 1929. And yeah, it does kind of look like the first Mickey Mouse short. He looks nothing like how he does, but what you might want to know about, the creation of this character is how did it happen? So before this, Walt Disney's cartoon studio was producing Oswald the Lucky Rabbit cartoons for Universal, but he had a bad meeting with one of the executives, and basically that executive hired away most of his team, leaving him and just a couple of people, including the animator for this short, Iwerks. And that story kind of explains why Walt became so anti-union later in his life, because a lot of the animators that got hired away from him were part of a union. And it explains why his company is so protective of its copyrights, but not anymore. So this short, Plain Crazy, was mostly a Walt Disney Iwerks joint. On a train, it's believed in legend that Walt came up with the idea of a mouse to replace the rabbit. And it could have just been a practical thing because they drew a lot of mice in the Alice comedies, which even predated Oswald. But I do want to spend this one giving my flowers to Iwerks because he single-handedly animated this entire thing at about 600, 700 drawings a day. Was a machine. That is how people have described him, just a machine pumping these out, and they all turned out to be pretty solid for the time. There are conflicting stories on who had more involvement in the creation of Mickey, like who was his true father, because Walt created the personality, mostly basing Mickey on himself, but created these first 1,000 or so drawings. He subtly redesigned the character to be more palatable for an animated cartoon compared to what I believe to be Walt's early doodles. Thus, gave Mickey life in his own way. So I do think that he deserves a certain percentage of the creation of Mickey Mouse, and it's kind of unfair that Walt took all the credit for all those years. It sort of makes like the Nikola Tesla of animation. But yeah, this whole short was animated in 2 weeks by and it is a bit hard to understand just how tough this would have been back in the 1920s, because this was animated 97 years ago, back before... I don't want to sound like a boomer, but back before we had computers to help us out. Like, this is all hand-drawn on cells, all painted up. And it still looks pretty good. Understanding the context. But there are key differences between this and later Mickey Mouse cartoons. Namely, Mickey and Minnie have completely different designs. They are shoeless, they have these big eyes that were later... redone, and you got a little cameo there from what could have either been Julius the Cat, a character from the aforementioned Alice comedies, or just straight up Felix the Cat, who was the biggest cartoon character before Mickey. That's a funny story in and of itself, because Julius is, if you really want to be picky, kind of a knockoff of Felix himself, so... yeah, this short, Plain Crazy, is kind of the epicenter for a lot of debates about ownership in animation. Oh, and here we get the most controversial thing about this first short, the fact that Mickey has a very different sort of attitude towards Minnie at this point in time. Look at what he's doing just to get a kiss out of her, and then he forces a kiss out of her, which is something that you could not picture the mascot of a family company doing today, but this is what they thought was comedy at the time, and I mean, I mean, I do have to acknowledge that these cartoons are a product of their time, and yeah, that is something that Mickey Mouse once did, and I'm sure that if he were real, this would keep him up at night. Oh, and this shot is pretty good too, because they were basically stacking the background on top of books and moving it just a little bit forward. And once you know how the sausage is made in these early animated cartoons, it still is kind of interesting to see them play out. And I'm sure that this cartoon is the most that most young people know of Charles Lindbergh, who was a famous American aviator at the time, but yeah. That's plain crazy. The short, its name, and what you can say about it. Now, the Gallopin Gaucho was test screened on August 2nd, 1928, after Plain Crazy failed to get a distributor, and released to the wide masses on December 30th, 1928, with sound. And it's with this short that it's most evident that upheld Mickey as a heroic figure reminiscent of silent film star Douglas Fairbanks. And that's a name that has largely faded to history amongst all but the biggest early cinephiles. But Douglas Fairbanks was one of the biggest names in Hollywood in the 1920s. He was one of the first Zorros, one of the first Robin Hoods, and starred in the 1927 picture The Gaucho, on which this short, The Gallopin Gaucho, is based. Another interesting thing is that Mickey is smoking and drinking, and yeah, this is fun to parade around now that Disney no longer, can do much about the copyright of it. Although they kind of tried to do that last year because the visuals of this short went into public domain before the soundtrack because, the revised version with sound that was released to the masses got copyrighted a year after it was released. It was made towards the very end of the year, so you could kind of see them as them. Oof, my boy. People are not going to look fondly on you. You could kind of see that as Disney being a little bit picky, but I'm playing it better safe than sorry. Seriously. And this dancing is pretty fun. And it's through this dancing that we see Mickey and Minnie sort of start to evolve. They're already wearing shoes, but after the dance, now their eyes are little buttons. Oh, and there's the first appearance of Pete as a cat. And I say as a cat because before this, and yes, Pete is the oldest continually used Disney character. He's 100 years old this year. He predates Mickey Mouse by 3 years. He was used in the Alice comedies and some of the Oswald cartoons. And he used to be a bear, but around here they changed him to a cat because I guess this just made him a better foil to a mouse. That old rigmarole of cats hating mice. It was understood back at the time too, and oof, this ostrich might be one of my favorite characters in these early Mickey shorts because I just love how he's animated. Props to the doodler. This ostrich is also just a perfect example of rubber hose animation, and I mean, just looking at him and how he moves and how he's drawn, you can see exactly how that term was coined because it's like all his limbs move like rubber hoses. And this was the style of animation in America throughout the 1920s and 1930s until it sort of slowly died towards the back half of the 1930s as more and more studios were pushing for realism, so these sorts of out there surreal movements became less fashionable, and that's kind of sad because they do have this quality to them that wasn't really seen in animation for a long time after this. As for how Mickey and Minnie look, going back to that, the sort of evolution of Mickey into this heroic figure, starting with the Gallopin Gaucho. Not all the way, he still, covers an ostrich in starch. Is sort of symbolizing a pivot away from, the more acerbic characterization that he had in Plain Crazy. And I think that's because, Walt heavily based Mickey on his own personality and probably hated seeing himself in Mickey. And in general, it is kind of interesting how the music makes this, a more complete package, but also it works about as well as a silent cartoon. I wouldn't have it without the music, but I would like to start bringing up the composers. For this one and the reshooting of Plain Crazy, they had Carl W. Stalling, who would later compose for the Looney Tunes. And, if you watched any number of Looney Tunes, you've probably heard his style. And yeah, I'm going to be talking a lot about other people in the early animation sphere that branched out over time. Oh, and you're gonna see that Walt really loved his butt jokes, like poking butts, setting them on fire, slapping them. He was really all in on that, and, that's... If you think how humor's crude now, it was basically the same way in the 1920s, just not as overt about it. So, with any cartoon that I've, finished talking about, I'm going to let the rest of the cartoon play instead of just mumbling over it like I do with MOUSECOMS. So, here we go, here's the rest of it. Here we have Steamboat Willie, the Big Boy, which originally premiered on November 18th, 1928, and this thing is a piece of history. It is one of the most important cartoons ever made, and this scene of Mickey coming up is amazing proof of what exactly this short set out to do and, the impact that it had on popular culture. Back in the silent era, it was near impossible to have that sort of synchronicity with the visuals on screen, because the most you had is a pianist in the corner who could maybe, play along with the cartoon they were given, but with the introduction of sound, you had this scene, which is sort of a sync test to make sure that the visuals and the sound are lining up. But it also adds so much to the dimension of the cartoon when you can see and hear a gag in, combination. It was a real money shot, and it really changed the way that cartoons were done. Now it was about singing and dancing and putting on a big pre-recorded performance, and, not everyone adapted overnight. There were still silent cartoons and silent films through to 1929, but after 1930, it was pretty much the standard. And I'm saying that even though Steamboat Willie, as a lot of you probably know by now, was not the first sound cartoon by any means, there were some experiments in the mid-1920s. You had the Fleischer brothers doing sing-alongs with Coco the Clown, and just a little while before Steamboat Willie hit the scene, you had Dinner Time, which was made by the Van Buren Studios for their Aesop's Fables, and Dinner Time is in the public domain. You can check it out whenever you want. It's a thing. I do want to be nice to it because it was pretty difficult to make sound work in animation, it has got its merit, Dinner Time, even if it's alleged that Walt went to see it just to hate watch it and say our cartoon is going to be way better. And even though Steamboat Willie is iconic and most people have seen it, it isn't, perfect. Obviously, these animators were, working to the bone to get this out. Oh, and Minnie's got a slight redesign here. Now she's got a flower hat. Good for her. But yeah, the fact that this still works and parts of it are still funny is a testament to, just how far these people were going and just how hard they were working to get these cartoons to work. So the music for Steamboat Willie was composed by Wilfred Jackson and Bert Lewis. Wilfred Jackson continued to work for Disney, even directing films as late as Lady and the Tramp, and pretty much all of the characters were voiced by Walt himself, grunting, and I don't think that there's any audible dialogue in this short. I don't think they had a script or anything. Some people think the parrot is talking, but I think it's funnier if it's just vaguely speech-like squawking. Now, coming up is, the big, musical production that the characters are putting on, which became a big thing for the Mickey Mouse cartoon series, just stopping to play music. And the song they picked couldn't be any more controversial because it's Turkey in the Straw, and, the original song isn't controversial, but at the time, around the 1910s, 1920s, its melody was repurposed into a different song with some racist lyrics. But the music sheet just saying the original title, Turkey in the Straw, I think it's clear that it's supposed to be the original Turkey in the Straw song that they're playing. As for other songs that, we don't really think about anymore, the song that Mickey is whistling at the start is about a steamboat sailing up the Mississippi. That's what the melody is in reference to, and the short itself is based on a movie from around this time called Steamboat Bill Jr., so more you know. And obviously, best part of this short is Mickey breaking what little character he has at this point and just swinging a cat around by its tail. Overall, a lot of animal abuse in these early Mickey Mouse cartoons, which you'd think the joke gets old, but no. Still funny in a dark sort of way, going back to the early Mickey Mouse days when he was still a bit more of a rascal. Now, one little fun fact is, what we're hearing right now is the second attempt at recording, because the first went out of sync. So that's a good lesson for any of ya. Just keep working until it works. The Barn Dance was the first Mickey Mouse cartoon to be made in 1929, and it takes the lead of Steamboat Willie in that you can see them starting to construct stories around the idea that we've got visuals along with sound now, so let's see where we can go with that. And it was released around March 15th, 1929, and it's still got a lot of the same rubber hose animation and thin characterization. It's just an excuse for some cartoon gags. But that's all people wanted at the time because Steamboat Willie was a runaway success. And, this is a pretty interesting follow-up. It's in a different place, but, it's back in Mickey's home, a barnyard, and that is partially based on Walt's childhood growing up in a farm in Kansas, I think. And, it's setting us up for the more familiar, boy, is that a, cutting-edge car Peter's driving. So if you view Plain Crazy and the Gallopin Gaucho as pilots, then Steamboat Willie being the one that caught on makes it sort of the first episode that people were supposed to see, and the Barn Dance as the second episode. So this is the encore, even though, Gallopin Gaucho had sound added later on. As for the animation of Mickey and Minnie, the designs aren't too different from what we see in Steamboat Willie. I think Pete is a little shorter to make the gags work. And this is, I think, the end of a runner of Mickey pulling his arms in frustration. That's a fun little thing to point out, and, it's just a charming thing to see Mickey do, gives him character. Sound effects are a big part of what makes this tick, all this clanking of machinery and the sound effect of hearts coming out of Mickey a bit earlier on is one of the first in a Disney film to be truly ethereal. And we've got, in terms of the narrative, it is a very thin narrative, but it is this little competition between Mickey and Pete to, give Minnie a good time at the upcoming Barn Dance. And downer ending is that Mickey fails. This is not a happy ending for Mickey. He doesn't really get what he wanted out of it. And it is kind of fascinating to see Minnie fall for Pete. That is something that you can't really picture happening anymore. And you can kind of see with how Mickey and Minnie are kind of moving in sync, moving kind of the same way, that the cores of personality animation were still to be invented. All the characters kind of move in the same kind of way. And that's not necessarily a bad thing in cases like this, where it's about love and they're supposed to be one big unit. But you can tell that these people were ready to make it big and put more of a characterization into these characters. This scene right here is definitely a start. We've got Mickey's shoes getting big and yeah. In terms of personnel, this is one of the first for Liz Clark, who had been around since the Alice comedies, but now he was contributing some in-betweening in these early Mickeys, and later on he'd become one of the famous 9 old men, so one of the 9 most, successful and renowned animators at Walt Disney, one of the ones that Walt personally trusted with the animation division the most. And yet not one of the 9 only important old men at Disney, but that is, part of the mystique of Disney. You've got these little legends about the company that can be easily, dispelled as being quite embellished. But that doesn't really take away from the importance of these cartoons, and they are incredibly important. Something I did notice is that, We've got little gags of Minnie's nose growing as she turns it up to Mickey. And earlier on, Mickey's head turning into a jackass in embarrassment. So that got me thinking, how long were they thinking of adapting Pinocchio? Because those are two things that happen in that movie 11 years later. That gets me excited, the fact that these are happening only 11 years before the release of some of the most legendary movies in history. I'm gonna savor the day that those movies, Pinocchio, Fantasia, Snow White, become public domain, because it's not long now. It's not long now. The fifth Mickey Mouse short, The Opry House, was originally released on March 20th, 1929, and gosh, March 1929 was a pretty busy month for Mickey. Now, granted, it is pretty difficult to verify these release dates these days, because not only would it have been, different from theatre to theatre, but back in these days when all the United States were less interconnected, it could have been different from state to state. You never really quite think about that. And what's interesting is, this is the first short to not feature Minnie in a physical appearance. She does appear on this poster right here, but yeah, starting now, it's her relationship with Mickey isn't the main priority of a story. She'll come back sometimes, but it becomes more about making the start of an adventure with Mickey, if I'm trying to, not talk over Mickey dancing around on a broom. That was words. This is the Disney debut of Ben Sharpstein, who was a phenomenal director for the studio in later years, and it is, you are starting to see that the animation, I think they're putting more frames into it, into each movement, and it is giving the, movements a little more life. They aren't as fast-paced and snappy. You've got little moments like how fast the big guy is moving, but then you've got the moment after that where he's sitting on Mickey, where, it's a little slower, yet you're able to get the movement psychologically. It's not necessarily realistic per se, because it would have been very, very hard to get live reference in the 1920s when film was already hard enough to come by. But yeah, you do start to notice this a little more. They are becoming better animators with each short, and that is going to lead to something with how much development Disney wants. This is one of the most dated Mickey Mouse cartoons in terms of its setting, because it's set in a vaudeville act, which is something that Mickey Mouse... It is the decade that this really was at its height, vaudeville, I think. But it also opens up a whole other can of worms with this being the debut of Mickey Mouse's gloves. Although he had worn them on the title card and the posters up to this point, this is the first time that they appear on his hands in a short. And this pretty much solidifies his appearance for the next decade or so. There are subtle differences to how they draw him, what kind of body or eyes they give him, but now we're basically at classic Mickey after he gets finished with this weird Arabian routine and some Jew jokes right after. Mickey's dance later on is sort of a Monroe Silver routine, I think. He was a popular Jewish entertainer at the time, and you can't really brush these jokes off, but you do have to acknowledge that they were made 100 years ago and don't necessarily reflect what entertainment is like right now in 2025. Also, just about the gloves, it is hotly debated whether this is a part of the character and a lot of the cartoon character from this time having a inspiration in minstrelsy and minstrel shows, you know, the whole blackface routine that Americans loved at the time. A lot of, Disney animators and experts will tell you the same story, that it's so his arms don't disappear when, they're near his body. So I think that's a more innocent explanation for the gloves, but you still do need to acknowledge the historical context for why, these discussions are had in the first place, and Mickey has a lot of hair in this short, which is interesting. It is basically a surrealist gag because you can't really picture Mickey having hair. This is just to accentuate the idea of him being a mad pianist. What's also fun about this cartoon is that it's apparently the debut of a cat creatively named Catnip, who only appeared a few times in a few more shorts in 1929 before Pete came back into the spotlight. Basically, Catnip replaced Pete for a little bit, and then Pete came back and became Mickey's mouse-cat rival for the rest of time. And I hope you like these piano gags because they are going to be a bit more embellished later in the year. And I just hope you like the Opry House. Episode 6, When the Cat's Away, which originally premiered around May 3rd, 1929. The title is a play on the phrase, "While the cat's away, the mice will play," which I don't think people say anymore, but this is another appearance of Tom Cat, aka Catnip. Not that he does much in this episode except for leave his house. He's drinking a lot of whiskey, making this, another joke that must have been controversial during the Prohibition period. You hear a lot about how, Disney is just completely safe and innocent, but some of these early Mickey cartoons have an edge to them. Now, what makes this episode particularly fascinating in the context of the Mickey Mouse catalog is that it's pretty much the only one where Mickey and Minnie are mouse-sized. They are depicted as really small. And another, key difference between this and especially a lot of the later ones is that they're depicted as just two random mice in a whole legion of mice that invade a house. And these mice do look pretty familiar. They are sometimes nude and shoeless, which makes them quite similar to the ones in the Alice comedies that are like sort of direct ancestors to Mickey and Minnie. In fact, this short, When the Cat's Away, is basically a sequel to Alice Rattled by Rats from 1925. It's basically the same setup, but I'm sure that the jokes are different. As you can see here, they're still making use of every public domain or accessible song that they can. Disney was always playing it pretty safe with what material they did and didn't use. And, if it's public domain, then they'll use it, much like how they still use Mickey Mouse. And the short is also the third appearance of a parrot after Steamboat Willie and the Barn Dance, and I think they wanted the parrot to be part of, the wider Mickey Mouse cast, but it doesn't seem like anyone knew how to make good jokes around it. What is kind of eerie about this short is that even though it is about playing music, that is still the novelty of Mickey Mouse at this point. Mickey Mousing, playing piano keys, and making that a part of, the production. It's actually kind of, unsettling whenever they aren't playing music. There is this ambience to it. I'm not saying it's flat out horror, but it is something to see these 1920s cartoon mice play around in, a house, and you can't really hear much except the crackling of the old recording. But after this one, When the Cat's Away, they will slowly shift away from the novelty of the pre-recorded music. Oh, and here's a classic mouse stereotype in animation, a mousetrap, and some cheese with holes in it. You can tell this is an early one because, 6 shorts in and they're still figuring out how tall to make Mickey and how often to play the music. This is kind of an experimental one in terms of tone, and it is a very fascinating one for that, even if it's not the funniest one so far. if nothing else, it is very sweet to see Mickey and Minnie enjoying a song and dance and doing something legitimately romantic, because there was always something separating them in early shorts, but no, they get a dance this time, and it is really nice. A nice little happy ending for this little one. The Barnyard Battle was originally released around June 1st, 1929, and this is another one that I don't have too much to say about, so I will let it speak for itself after I have my little yap about it. So, there's a big, lanky Mortimer kind of fellow that is in this one, and, that is an interesting gag that they like to do around this time, blowing with your lungs so hard that, you do sort of lose all your weight. That is a gag that they, have a lot in the background and such, and you have to wonder if audiences in 1929 never got over that, never thought that it got old. It was something that they always craved more of. And this short is a bit interesting in terms of historical context, because there are actual war references here, but they're all over the place. Like, I don't know if it's pro or against something, and, the people who, analyze cartoons a bit deeper than me, they don't either. So, it might just reflect Walt's political naivete at this point in his life. Oh, and this scene of the physical, this sometimes gets censored out of releases. I guess because it just hits too close to home, I don't know. It doesn't really, add credence to any sort of theory that this is just a war game. Like, this just seems like an actual battle that Mickey is applying for. But the gags in here are fun. In terms of other things I can say about it that will come up later, there is sort of a 3D background thing going on with the March to Battle happening later. And, it makes sense that the mice, who are still depicted as a legion here, that their enemies would be cats, even though it is difficult to tell what the messaging of this short is. Overall, the message seems to be that cats and mice hate each other. This is the sort of 3D background that I'm talking about. Not 3D in the current sense of it, but, it seems like they put a lot of effort into making this dimensional, and I really like to see that. Now, this short, because of stuff like that title card of sorts, makes this the first since probably the Gallopin Gaucho where it wouldn't be too different if it was silent. Of course, it is heightened by the sound, but it's no longer about playing music and that being, the extent of the novelty. I guess that you could say that the wartime sound effects are something that people wanted to hear at this point in time. And I think that this is the last ever appearance of Catnip, the Pete replacement for a little while, so I guess he's fully public domain. I don't think that Disney has a trademark on a character as obscure as him. Another couple differences in this particular early short is that Mickey seems to have a different laugh. Perhaps they were experimenting with the voice. I mean, while recording Steamboat Willie first, Walt provided the voice and it was sort of a falsetto. Same with his original voice for Minnie, but other people were occasionally voicing the characters and they all had their own different spins on it. Another early thing about the Mickey Mouse cartoon series at this point of time is that you'll notice the teeth are pretty big when they have big smiley teeth, and those would be reduced in size over time, so it's another way that you can tell that this is pretty early into their catalog. But overall, I don't really mind the Barnyard Battle. It's another one that's not one of my favorites, but you can tell that they're in a groove now, and they are, gradually improving and making stuff that could benefit the sound system, even if I don't think that this short... I think that this short would have still had the same premise if it was a black and white cartoon, a silent cartoon, is what I'm saying. But yeah, this is them, getting used to the fact that they have sound now and seeing what they can accomplish. The Plowboy, the 8th Mickey Mouse cartoon, was released around June 28th, 1929, and this short is a slight evolution on the others, just as every one of these is. First of all, the font in the title card is a bit different. It'll change around over the years. And you can briefly see Mickey with pie eyes, which were a staple of these classic rubber hose inkblot cartoons, and the reason they are depicted like that, I can't really say for sure, but I can tell you the reason that they're named pie eyes. It's because they look like any sort of circular dish, like a pie or a pizza, with a small piece taken out of them. But it occasionally is part of the classic Mickey Mouse look, and it is something that, is a product of cartoons from the 20s and 30s that you're only really doing these days if you want to do a throwback, so yeah, it is kind of interesting to see it develop within the Mickey Mouse universe. The short marks the debut of Horace Horsecollar and possible debut of Clarabelle Cow. These are both, secondary Mickey Mouse characters that were initially quite prominent in the late 20s and early 30s. Not so much right now. And the reason I say that this is the possible debut for Clarabelle Cow is Clarabelle is a cow, and there have been cows in the series beforehand, like in Plain Crazy, so it's hard to tell if this is supposed to be a reintroduction or a full-blown new character. What matters most is that she and Horace are treated as barnyard animals, while Mickey and Minnie are treated as people. Horace being a bit more anthropomorphic here comes off as a joke, whereas later on they will gradually anthropomorphize him more, and that is going to lead to a different dynamic, sort of. Minnie, I don't know what's going on with her eyes there, but they have evolved 10 years too quickly. I mean, I have no problem with how they look there. It offers an interesting visual. But this is a fun little short for Minnie. For one thing, it is clearly displayed that Mickey being forceful in her advances of her is a bad thing, so, you know, you do feel bad for Minnie in this, which is good. But this is also voice actress Marjorie Rolston's first go at her. Marjorie Rolston, I should say, who was one of the inkers at the studio who usually went cruelly uncredited for all the ink that they had to put to these cells. But I want to just praise her at the moment too, because, you know, ink department, that's got to be a lot of hard work, and she was also given the first acting credits for Minnie Mouse, well, some of the first. She's the first female voice actress for Minnie Mouse, but later she would be replaced by another woman from the ink department, Marcelette Garner, who they stuck with for a long time after this. And as you can see, because Horace and Clarabelle aren't necessarily considered people yet, their noises are conveyed through instruments. And this is another one where there's not really a lot to the plot, just simple backyard shenanigans or barnyard shenanigans. A problem that I have with it is that there's a lot of odd editing in the sequences later on where Mickey's getting pelted by rocks, but otherwise, this is another one from the period where they're in their groove and still playing around with this world and embellishing it, developing it, giving it new characters. And this might be the first Disney animation from Jack King, who would work for both Disney and Looney Tunes shorts until the 1950s. I'll go a bit more into him later. But that's really all I have to say for the Plowboy. Enjoy the rest of the show. The Karnival Kid is the 9th Mickey Mouse cartoon released around July 31st, 1929, and it is a very important one, probably one of my favorites next to Steamboat Willie at this point. It is a very big part of the Mickey Mouse canon because it is the first time in which Mickey has audible dialogue singing about hot dogs at a hot dog vendor at this carnival. And because of that, hot dog became a catchphrase of his. And I just find that kind of charming. It's sort of like whatever your first word is as a baby, your parents will treat that as your catchphrase. Oh my goodness. That must have freaked children out back in the day. But yeah, we've got a lot more performing again. I think that's part of the reason that I like this short a bit more, that they're doing more music now. I guess that's what the public craved. Now, the funny thing about Mickey's dialogue is that even though Walt is generally considered Mickey's first voice actor, Carl W. Stalling, the composer, is actually providing the voice here. It obviously isn't Walt's falsetto, it's something a little bit different. And it is kind of interesting that they waited until the 9th short to give Mickey actual dialogue, because he does say a few shorter sentences later on. I don't know necessarily the thought process behind this, because by this time, July 1929, other cartoon characters were starting to speak whenever they had sound. Of course, we're at the start of the age of the talkie, the sound films. The earliest Mickey Mouse cartoons are more soundies. They're playing around with how sound can work with animation, and I guess dialogue, like having the characters talk, wasn't as important. But I guess it is starting to become a bit more important here, because starting with the Karnival Kid, they are slowly given a bit more dialogue, and I think that was Catnip again. I think that was one of his last appearances, so apologies for my blemish on the commentary a bit earlier. This episode is continuing a bit with the jokes we've been hearing and seeing for a while, herding animals and flexible and plausible anatomical feats. And not only that, but this is just flat out, retreading stuff from an Oswald short. In 1927, they released the Oswald short All Wet, in which it is sort of like a precursor to the Karnival Kid, in that there is this extended gag of Oswald trying to make hot dogs, but they act like actual dogs. And of course, they don't really want to be eaten, but this is not their kind of day. And if you compare All Wet and the Karnival Kid side by side, you can already see that strides have been made in character animation and how the characters behave and how their world looks. Mickey Mouse has started to have a different look and feel. There's more movement, a bit more personality. Not that the Oswald cartoons didn't have any, but the Karnival Kid is just a good example of how they were gradually, changing and experimenting with what works with Mickey Mouse and this new age of sound and stuff. Because this also has a rare sight for a, sound cartoon. It has a time card. And, modern cartoons have time cards and stuff, but it isn't something that you usually needed after the Silent Age, because you could have a bit more dialogue on screen to explain what is happening. You had better picture quality to better insinuate what is going on. But overall, I think I really like the Karnival Kid. It's not perfect at all, but it is entertaining. And I think that comes down to this tying Mickey Mouse's theatrical debut, Steamboat Willie, as the longest. Both of these are 7 minutes and 40 seconds. And see, he can be friends with cats sometimes. That's interesting and cute. So I'll let you watch the rest of this. Mickey's Follies, short number 10, originally released around August 28th, 1929, and by this time, Walt Disney Studios was starting to become a more elaborate production. They had way more animators, they had way more inkers, they had more musicians, they had the whole kit and caboodle, and this is the first short to be released after the premiere of their secondary series, the Silly Symphonies, which those first couple Silly Symphonies are now public domain, and I could not be happier because they tell the story of Disney in their own way. This particular short is the first to not be directed by either Walt Disney or Ub Iwerks, but rather by Wilfred Jackson, which set him up to be a pretty frequent director at Disney going forward. This short also has a little ring around the rosy routine right here, and this was a shockingly common sight in early animation, and I think because it was practical to make, because you only needed to make 3 or 4 drawings and loop them to make a makeshift dancing wheel. Here's another set of jokes that obviously come from a very different time, because it seems to be about a husband and wife fighting, and there is some physical violence going on, and this routine must have brought down the house in the 1920s, but, for the past, I'd say 50, 55 years, you couldn't really do this without any sort of satirical context to, make it clearer that this is not a positive depiction of a marriage. This short also could have been a frontrunner in jokes about hating opera, because I don't know if it was that popular in America ever, but this is the start of them making it, cool to hate. And that will lead to bigger things for animation down the line, trust me. You can see Clarabelle Cow coming up in a bit, and she's starting to get more anthropomorphic. This is no longer her Plowboy days. And here's more of those little Mickey Mouse clones / ancestors. I'll just let a bit of the rest of the short play before talking about the Mickey Mouse theme song in a little bit. So coming up, we've got the theme song for the Mickey Mouse cartoon series, Minnie's Yoo-Hoo, which is explicitly stated to be Mickey's theme song, just a little love letter to his girlfriend. And an instrumental version of this song started playing at the start of, I'd say a lot, maybe not most, of the Mickey Mouse cartoons, but here's what it sounds like coming out of the mouse.
I'm the guy they call Little Mickey Mouse. Got a sweetie down in the chicken house. Neither fat nor skinny, she's a horse and Winnie. She's my little Minnie Mouse. When it's feeding time for the animals, and they howl and growl like the cannibals, I just turn my heel to the hen house seal, and you'll hear me sing this song. Oh, the old tomcat with his meow, meow, meow. Old hound dog with his bow, wow, wow. The crow, caw, caw, and the mules, ee-haw. Gosh, what a racket like an old buzzsaw. I have listened to the cocoa cookies cuckoo, and I've heard the rooster cocking doo-doo. With the cows and the chickens, they all sound like the dickens when I hear my little Minnie.
Well, that was terrifying. Those early mouth movements are pretty freaky in motion, but if you pause them, which was impossible to do way back in the day, they're all pretty funny drawings individually. You know, you can tell that the artists were having a lot of fun, looking at their own mouths in the mirror and drawing them onto Mickey, even if it's gonna take a little while for the actual movement to be realistic, take a little more influence from how our mouths actually move in motion rather than just as images in a mirror. And Mickey's singing voice for that has remained anonymous. It's possible it could have been Carl or Walt, but I think there's a big possibility that it could have been Ub Iwerks or one of the animators. I don't think I've ever heard Ub Iwerks talk himself, so if that's his voice, then heaven speed. Mickey's Follies is kind of entertaining for what it is. Okay, right after we got introduced to Minnie's Yoo-Hoo, we have short number 11, Mickey's Choo-Choo, which originally released around September 26th, 1929. And as you can see, it is about a train, and this comes from 100 years ago, so it's very different from the trains that you ride on today, but this is still the iconic visual of what a train looks like. And I think cartoons have a part to play in that, a little bit. Because this is also another one on a sort of, rail setting, sort of like Oswald the Lucky Rabbit's debut short, Trolley Trupples. Not his first to be made, but his first to be released. And I think that this train fella is one of the creepiest main characters at this point in the Mickey Mouse canon. And yeah, that seems to finally be Walt providing Mickey's singing voice. And what a song to start with it. This is another, this is a pretty by-the-numbers Mickey Mouse short. I really don't have too much notes for it, just trains and special effects. This could have been a test for early smoke and water effects for animation, just seeing if they can get those sorts of reactions and possibilities in the Mickey Mouse universe, make them part of the routine, part of the universe, part of making it a similar universe to our own. But they're still very impressionistic water and smoke effects. You can see Mickey's eyebrows, they are quite big, which raises a lot of questions about where his eyes really end. Are they just the buttons, or are they still the whole top of his head? I think it is just done for clarity, but I do kind of like the idea that it is just the little button pie eyes. Not that this isn't an iconic look for Mickey in his own right. So it's more of the typical shenanigans, basically plane crazy, but with trains instead of planes, and Mickey and Minnie's relationship is getting a lot warmer. You know, they're singing songs for each other and stuff. It is nice to see them hanging out and getting into little adventures with themselves with a happy ending. As a matter of fact, the plane crazy influence isn't just in the story, but they do recycle some animation of the cow later on. You will have a good look at that. And I'm sure they probably thought, it's been long enough since Plane Crazy was in theaters, we can just put this in and people will buy it. And they did, because I don't think any of the newspaper critics at the time complained about, repeated animation. If anything, they might have been excited to see these cycles in animation again. But if you're still criticizing Disney for repeating animation or recycling stuff in the 60s and 70s and 80s when they were low on money, just know that that practice arguably predates the creation of Mickey Mouse. It's always something they have done for the sake of practicality. And Mickey's Choo-Choo is a good example of that. It's an alright little tale of trolley troubles, or train troubles in this case, and I'll let you watch the rest of it. Episode 12, The Jazz Fool, originally released around October 15th, 1929. What really throws me off about this short is that the music that Mickey and his pals are playing here doesn't sound especially jazzy, but this was at the tail end of the jazz age. of the 1920s, so I'm sure that they were capitalizing on that. And look at how much things have improved since Plain Crazy in terms of, just how much the characters move and dance. It is kind of incredible that this is just a year later. But on the flip side, it is kind of impressive that this is only 8 years before Snow White. You see, we're seeing horror start to anthropomorphize a little more and it being taken as less of a non sequitur. These characters have their own little ways of dancing, and that just breathes so much life into the world. Mickey himself expresses a wide range of emotions during his performance that he puts on in this, and he spits a lot. I don't know if that black spit is still supposed to be tobacco, but I don't know. This is a short that also sort of goes back to an earlier point because the past few have included more dialogue, but this one puts voicing on the back burner for a day to hone their skills at expressiveness. The animators are trying to do a better job at making the expressions come off in a way that makes the characters feel alive and like they're in the theater with you. This is another one where, I don't have much to say about it. This is one of the shorter cartoons from this period, clocking in at just under 6 minutes. Usually about 6.5, 7 minutes is the average for these early Mickey Mouses, but this one, I guess they must have been short on time, or they had some gags that they had to cut. But I think that they could have filled it with stuff that they had done before, because people didn't really seem to mind when they had lifted gags from earlier Mickeys and Oswalds. But about the whole, conflict and climax of the Jazz Fool in particular, the piano and stool gags from the Opry House are expanded. There's more of that if you wanted that. The piano keys line up far less with the notes than last time, so if you're one of those sticklers for musical instruments and animation playing exactly how they do, then you're probably not going to like the Jazz Fool as much as the Opry House on that front. But in terms of, how Mickey reacts to stuff, this is an innovation, sort of, in that he is reacting to music just as much as he is creating it, and that is the bulk of the story rather than just a gag near the end like in the Opry House. This is a story about Mickey confronting something, and it's an early hint at Mickey's command over inanimate objects backfiring, and that's gonna set us up for the Sorcerer's Apprentice. Trust me, when I get to MOUSECOMS in another 11 years. So yeah, I really like the Jazz Fool. I enjoy it. I'll let you watch the rest of it. 13 more to go, starting with Jungle Rhythm, which originally released around November 15th, 1929, and this episode has some historic importance as the first to release after the Wall Street crash and so during the Great Depression. It's the first one where an instrumental section of Minnie's Yoo-Hoo plays on the title card, as I mentioned a bit earlier, and these shorts took more than a couple weeks to make, so I'm sure that they didn't make this for the new generation of Americans who were suffering financial troubles during the Depression, but it is getting to where Mickey is becoming a bit more of a valued asset in the entertainment industry at this time. He is something that they can afford with a few pennies for tickets to the movies, and that did help Mickey become way more of an icon at this point in time, something that children and families really looked up to. So you can see how early shorts like this, like Jungle Rhythm, not only informed American culture, but sort of were influenced by it too, even if you probably wouldn't recognize such today, because Mickey's hunting and stuff, and the debate about animal hunting is a lot stronger today. It would make Mickey considered less heroic. But as for where the setting is, he's just in the jungle today for some reason. It's an early chance to see some more exotic animals in the Mickey Mouse universe, a more interesting place than the Americana that we're used to seeing him in at this point in the series. And it is one of the most jam-packed with music at this point. They play a lot of songs. They fit a lot into this one. They even perform Auld Lang Syne, the New Year's song, despite the short releasing in November. As a matter of fact, it is so thin on plot and so music heavy that it actually drew criticism from critics at the time for not having a story, not having any setup or motivation on Mickey's part to be in the jungle doing these things. And I think that just comes down to this whole premise being an excuse for Mickey to dance around with some apes and lions and stuff. There's not much to it. I wouldn't call this one of my favorites, but it is another example of the evolution of the Mickey Mouse series and how there's less restraint in terms of what they could do. Another thing that was very difficult for people to get at the time is censors originally weren't happy about the belly dancing lion. They had to fight to get that in the cartoon. But I think it's worth it because it adds a little more to the visual gaggery. And overall, I'll just let you form your own opinion on Jungle Rhythm because I have run out of things to say about it. Happy Halloween on December 2nd, 1929, said the Disney Company as they released episode 14 of the Mickey Mouse series, The Haunted House. Sometimes just called Haunted House, but I'll trust the title card over my instincts. Now, this is the Mickey Mouse series' first dabbling into horror, which will set it up for later efforts like The Mad Doctor, and this is one that I sometimes put on because what a start this thing is. It's got a nice dark look to it. And I do have to give my flowers to Jack King, who is considered the director for this short. I don't think that's public knowledge, but he is uncredited for his directorial status in most areas, but he is on the available production materials for this short, and he's going to be pretty important to animation history. He'll go off in the mid-30s to direct some Looney Tunes, even some of the earliest Porky cartoons, before returning to Disney. And you can see a lot of the advancements in the animation here too, with the rain effects and the need for a more chilling atmosphere, With how much lighting was important in these early theatrical days, it is pretty amazing how they could have all these types of grey on screen, In terms of actual advancements to animation rather than just borrowing and honing in on advancements like sound and color, something that Disney's cartoons are well regarded for is that there's way more shading in these, and it is going to become a more dense and realistic environment as it goes on. The light sources, they don't always make a lot of sense, but there is something to be said about it. I really love that shot of Mickey Mouse's back in silhouette. Like, they already know that is an iconic set of 3 circles. They already know that if you look at them from behind, that's still Mickey. You can hide it in theme parks all for the rest of time. What this short also does is it's kind of a sequel to The Skeleton Dance, which was the first Silly Symphony. It's basically an excuse to see that gang of skeletons again who were dancing around that cemetery. I'm sure you all see them on Halloween at some point. But it's a chance for them to be in the same room as Mickey Mouse, which must have been a pleasure for them. And even though a lot of the animation from that is flat out reused here, it's still nice to see them again. I'm not so sure about this hooded skeleton being part of the group now. I think it's supposed to be like a ringleader. But yeah, they don't add much. This is also one of the ones where Mickey starts talking a little more. One of the things that really dates this is Mickey saying mammy when he's tired, which is a word for mommy used in minstrel shows and in The Jazz Singer, that Al Jolson movie that is important but also very outdated. So yeah, you do just sort of have to acknowledge that sometimes. At least Walt has the semi-burden of saying it, as this was another one where he voiced Mickey. More of them just bringing their bones all over the place. At least they're in a new environment. As a semi-sequel to The Skeleton Dance, I guess that was important, giving them a different place to do all their bony shenanigans. And overall, this is fun. I like it. It has problems, but I do like it for its animation. It is nice to see the skeletons again. It is nice to see a bit more of a genre in a Mickey cartoon, and as the penultimate cartoon of the 1920s, it is setting up a more atmospheric tone for some of the cartoons that we will see in the 1930s. Yeah, history is being made with each one of these, and that's nice to see. I'll let you watch the rest of it. Here we go. Wild Waves, the end of an era, originally released around December 18th, 1929. This is the last short for a lot of things. This is the last one that Iwerks animated before he got a different contract at a different place, which I will talk about a little bit more in a later MOUSECOMS, because there's already a lot of stuff to talk about here. The short was the last to feature that title card with the big eyes, and even though Get a Horse used it in 2013, it was for the retro charm of that short. A way off model version can be seen on reissues of these early shorts distributed by the next studio, Columbia Pictures, but the old Celebrity Productions title card is still, what people think of when they think of early Mickey title cards, even though they do slowly change over time. And that swimsuit for Minnie must have been scandalous at the time. This is also the last Mickey Mouse cartoon to be recorded on Celebrity's Powers Cinephone system, because then they started recording them on a different sort of audio mechanism. But this is a first for something. It is the first Mickey Mouse cartoon to be directed by Burt Gillett, and he will be a very important director for a lot of Disney stuff in the 1930s. I was looking at his IMDb and I kept saying, wow, he did that one? Additionally, this was the first one to be released after the Walt Disney Studio was renamed to Walt Disney Productions, with the establishment of music and merchandising subsidiaries. So, in due time, you could have Mickey Mouse on the cover of a book or as a toy. Not quite yet, but it's not the first time a cartoon character had been merchandised, because we do have a lot of Felix merchandise from the 1920s, in collectors' hands. But yeah, Mickey is on his way to becoming a firm fixture of American popular culture, and I think he earned it, because this is another very fun short. It's another one that borrows a lot from the Oswald short, All Wet, because it has the same sort of gags with the waves. In fact, I think a lot of the animation of the waves is reused. But you can also kind of see that it is still impressionistic. They're not trying to make realistic waves, they're just trying to make funny waves, or adventurous waves, or waves that can give them a good cartoon. And you can definitely see that Mickey and Minnie have developed a lot as characters. Not super deep three-dimensional beings, but their personalities have changed a little bit since Plain Crazy. For one thing, there's just more to their designs that make them likable and give them quirks. Like, I like how Minnie wears pumps to the beach, even though that is entirely impractical. And this is also another weird appearance of Mickey's silly, kind of creepy old singing voice. But this is another one where it's believed that Walt didn't personally voice him, rather that his lines were provided by Carl Stalling again. You can still see that the characters, not everything about them is the exact same from short to short, but they are more reliable as entertaining figures, and that is the important thing. And not only is the development apparent in how they behave, but it's also apparent in how these shorts end, because, way back in stuff like Plain Crazy and the Plowboy, Mickey had difficulty winning over Minnie, but it seems that as the series has gone on, it has finally become easier for him to have a firm relationship with her. It makes for an unintentional story arc across this first year and a half with, them becoming much more of an item, and I think that's a really sweet way to close out 1929 for Mickey Mouse. It's said that this had to be the last cartoon that Iwerks worked on for Disney in the animation department, but Walt was overworking him and he got a better contract with a different studio, and I'll go a bit more into that if I do MouseComs again next year, but this has been pretty fun, just talking about the early Mickey Mouse cartoons and how they impacted the world of animation and Disney as a whole, and how they impacted how we perceive Mickey Mouse, even if all but Steamboat Willie are barely considered relevant by the Disney company today, which is pretty sad because I do want these shorts to be better known. Now, a question that I do have for a few of you, if you're old enough, is if you were around in the 1920s, do you remember when Mickey Mouse came out? I don't know if I have any super centenarians in my audience, but I would like to know that if you were there for when Mickey Mouse was becoming popular. Don't want you to strain to think about it because it's got to be really hard to remember that stuff after all this time. But yeah, I mean, the mouse has outlived most of us and will outlive us all, so I think it will be good to remember that there was a time when we didn't have Mickey Mouse, and when we got Mickey Mouse, the world changed forever. Goodbye for now.